Was it possible for a peasant to become a king? The story of King Arthur was a medieval tale. In fact, it goes back way beyond the medieval, probably to around the 6th century. But it involves the bastard child of Uther Pendragon and Igraine growing up in a modest household, modest knightly household, and then finally inheriting the throne of all England, the High King of England. And you could argue that it's a tale of rags to riches, except it's not really rags, is it, being the prince, literally the son of the High King himself, Uther Pendragon. So he certainly wasn't a peasant. He may have been brought up in a modest noble background, but he would have been in the top 5% of the population, at least in terms of wealth and opportunities. Do we have any factual examples of somebody rising from relatively low status to very high status? Well, yes, we do. We have quite a few of them, actually. William Marshall himself, he was born into a relatively poor noble household, still noble though, and rose to become Marshal of England and effectively king for a while. He acted as the regent to the king when the king himself was too young to make big decisions. So for a long time, in fact for a lifetime, he rose from minor nobility to tops of the nobility. So that's an impressive feat. You also have to remember though that there were many lifetimes lived where we don't actually have records of what happened at all. History, the written record of the past, is sometimes quite biased. It is written by people who need to be literate, obviously, and in the medieval period those were often monks. Not always. There were scriveners, there were secular writers, but they were paid more to do letters to court and deeds of land and things. The people recording the history were often religious people, and sometimes they were paid by wealthy people to write stories about them. In fact, we know about William Marshall in particular because he commissioned, rather his family commissioned, a biography about him a few years after his death. So it's bound to be slightly biased in his favour. I think it's unlikely, given that somebody was being paid to write about him, that it would be a warts and all story. Maybe he was a perfect knight, and maybe he was as brilliant as the biography says. I think it's quite likely that things were glossed over to a certain extent, because if somebody's paying you, you want to do, well, they might just say, take that bit out, quite frankly. I don't want that bit about my dad being written down, thank you very much. And also sometimes monks were writing with a view to spreading religious stories, or their supporter, somebody who's paying for the monastery, for example, or paying for a church to be built. They want to praise their patron as well. So it's not always completely straightforward how the written word comes across. But then again, we do have other tales too. There were, of course, no paternity tests, so you can't absolutely guarantee that your child is your child. You could imagine situations where by accident babies are swapped over. I think that would be fairly rare in noble households, and because people weren't in hospitals or the equivalent, it's unlikely that there would be another child to be swapped with. You could imagine a situation though where foul play was afoot and that somebody did a deal with the nurse, the midwife, and swapped a child over to get their son or perhaps daughter into a position of power. We don't really know, and we will never know. I don't think there's much likelihood of that, but I'm sure in the rich tapestry of history that's almost certainly happened one or two times. How do you show that you are powerful? How do you show that you're the king? Well, I suppose everybody says you're the king. We have examples, for example, when Richard III died at Bosworth and Henry Tudor took over. He was king. He had a very weak claim to the bloodline, but he did have a claim. But also he beat the other king in battle, and all of his mates said, "You're the king now." And he went, "Yes, I'm the king now." And everybody went, okay, fair enough, we're not going to be able to do anything about it, so you become king by your actions. I think it was Machiavelli that said it is as much a man acts as a prince that he is a prince, or something similar to that. So you would have to, if you were from modest stock and you wanted to better yourself, you would have to dress the part, you would have to act the part, you would potentially have to speak the part as well, because accents varied widely across England, medieval England, and there would probably be some quite extreme accents. So if you wanted to be perceived to be noble by those around you, you might need to speak a bit of Latin, you might need to speak and behave in a certain way, you might need to wear the right clothes with the right cloth, and have people around you saying who you were. Was it entirely possible to fake being noble? I think quite possibly yes. There weren't computer databases to check things out. There wasn't the same way of keeping records, and especially if you went somewhere further away from where you were born perhaps, or travelled long distances and then had the money and had the supporters to say who you were. Why would anybody disagree? Did anybody say, I don't think you're a lord from up north because you're now down south? I don't think anybody would question that if you behaved the right way and if you had the money and all the supporting evidence, the accoutrements, the right war horse, the right equipment, then maybe you could pretend to be a lord and in fact become a lord as a direct result of that. That of course would not be written down by anybody. Nobody would actually admit to that. So there is absolutely no record, and I am entirely speculating. But it's nice to think that there may have been people born to humble origins who elevated themselves through being clever, being sophisticated, and just fooling other people. And then they were convincing. Let's go back a bit though, because the medieval period is vast. It's 1,000 years. So obviously it changed wildly depending on the specific time and the geography as well. But if we just talk about the high medieval period, roughly the middle bit in England, and the feudal system, the system that was introduced by the Normans, basically you were born to your estate. If you were, like most of us would have been, 90% of the population that lived a fairly agrarian life, you would be a peasant. Now, peasant doesn't mean poor necessarily, although most peasants were relatively poor by modern standards, but it means that you were a farmer. You worked the land. That was your job. You grew food for yourself, and you grew food to pay your taxes, and you grew food for other people too. It varied hugely. Most peasants were bonded to the land, i.e. you had an obligation to work the land, and in return you got given the land by your lord, but you also had to pay, sometimes you had to pay money in rent, but often it was in terms of work and time, in particular on the lord's land. It gets very complicated, and this is not what this video is about, but you were very likely to have been born to your status, and it's almost certain that the majority of us stayed in that status. There is some record of people marrying a free man, for example, to become free, or in some cases deciding to go down the social ladder potentially to avoid some of the obligations that free men had to do. Now don't forget, being free is very different in a concept to the modern, especially the modern North American concept of what freedom means. You did have more literal freedom. You could do more with your life if you chose to do so, but you also lost the security net of being part of a household, if you like, being part of a system with obligations, noble obligations to you, form of justice, a form of location and land and security that way. So it's not just why would somebody want to be free or not. That's a misunderstanding. It's a very complicated subject. Chances are you would be a peasant. If you weren't a peasant, you would be noble. Nobility was a tiny fraction of the population, or you'd be somebody in the church, the clergy. Again, a relatively small fraction of the population. At the time, it was talked about those that fight those that work and those that pray. Now, it's obviously a vast oversimplification, massive oversimplification. It misses out all the jobs that women did, for example. It also misses out the urban class as well. So all the craftspeople, the skilled labourers who worked in specialist areas, making things, blacksmiths, cobblers, armour smiths, all of those kind of trades, plus merchant guilds. Merchants were incredibly wealthy and, varied in what they did. A lot of wool in England, of course, but all sorts of other kind of trade and investment. The concept of shares was developing as well. The concept of a mercantile class was developing. But broadly speaking, those that pray, those that fight, and those that work. Jean Froissart, the 14th century chronicler, actually specifically says the commons must labour to live, for they are born to work. And that was a generally held attitude. That was what you should do as far as many people were concerned. But if you were born to modest means, were there any legitimate ways of rising through the social structures? Was there a way to make your fortune and to rise to power? Well, yeah, there were actually three very clear ones. One was fighting, one was praying, the clergy, and one was trade, the merchant guilds and general business. So if you just go through those one by one. So fighting, you would need to join some kind of company, some kind of mercenary band, and you would need to go on raids. You would need to fight for somebody. You would be paid. But also, most importantly, if you captured somebody, you got a share of their value. And if you raided somewhere, you got to keep the goods. And if people wanted you to go away, they sometimes paid you off in coin. So you could very clearly get wealthy quite quickly if you were lucky and you were good at fighting. You also risk dying, of course, because many soldiers did die. But you could definitely rise to great status that way. The mercantile trade was expanding very rapidly, especially in the high medieval period. So if you were to run away to a town, you would have to stay there unrecaptured for a year and a day. Then you become a freeman of the town. It's a bit more complicated than that, but you could do that. You could associate yourself with a guild master, associate yourself, if you were lucky, with a trade, help out, slowly work your way up through those ranks. And you might be taught how to keep the books. You might be taught a specific craft trade. You could become a master mason in time. So you could definitely start to earn a lot more money and have a very, very dramatically increased status. Craft guilds were one thing, but also the business guilds were an area where it's likely you could become, not likely, it's possible to become fabulously wealthy. Some of the wealthiest merchants were much wealthier than kings in some cases. In fact, they often funded events that the king wanted to do, like wars and expansion plans and invasions. So merchants became fantastically wealthy and powerful. It was very difficult to go from being a merchant, though, to being noble. It did happen in the later medieval period, but nobility was considered by birth. So you couldn't technically become noble unless you were born to it. It was a bloodline thing, although there are some clear exceptions there. And lastly, and possibly the most likely course for somebody that's very bright, that has a good way with words and is not interested in labouring in the same way, the church. The church was a massively important institution. Outside nobility, outside the kingdoms and outside peasantry. Of course, they grew their own food, they had monasteries and they worked and they laboured in the same kind of way. But if you were bright and if you were politically savvy and if you were able to present things well, if you were able to have an argument, if you were good at learning, you could rise to the greatest of powers. There are many people from modest backgrounds who rose to fairly significant roles in the church, and in one or two cases they rose to the very highest possible position, that of Pope. We do know there is specifically one person that we're aware of that was born into, well, it says he was born into a very modest peasant background, Pope Sylvester II in 946 was born of peasant stock, at least that's what the stories tell us, and rose to become Pope. So there's at least one example. How accurate and how lowly a peasant he was, we'll never know, but that was clearly part of his backstory. Not every churchman, of course, came from a poor background. In fact, during the Norman period in particular, it was very common for people to be both noble and a bishop. The bishops generated quite a lot of money from the lands of the church. One famous one, you may have heard of the Bayeux Tapestry. Bishop Odo was the half-brother of William the Conqueror, and he is portrayed on that tapestry. He is thought to have commissioned it, and he's portrayed on that tapestry. He has his name sort of stitched into the cloth, and unusually he's portrayed carrying a club, and there's various discussions about what that means. He's clearly religious, but he's also fighting on horseback, and there is some discussion that the clergy in those days were not really permitted to draw blood, but they were allowed to smash people over the head with clubs because it wasn't actually cutting them as such. I mean, imagine you smash somebody hard enough over the head, there's blood going to be everywhere. But that seems to be an acceptable practice for a bishop to wield a club rather than a sword or a spear. So Bishop Odo, how pious he was, we don't know, but he was obviously keen on recording the history and the righteousness of William the Conqueror's conquest, his rule, because that's really what the Bayeux Tapestry is. The Bayeux Tapestry is a record of Harold versus William, but it's also clearly Norman propaganda up to a point, although it does show some setbacks, which I think is kind of interestingly honest of it to a certain extent. It shows horses failing to cross rivers, and it clearly shows Harold breaking his oath, things like that. So whether he did or didn't, we will continue to discuss. But it's a fantastic reference point, and in particular for bishops bashing people over the head with a club. Obviously, it's likely that to rise in the church, you needed to be pious, and you needed to be good at giving sermons, and you needed to obey the rules. I'm sure there were some people that were genuinely religious to a very great extent, and were genuinely interested in the religious part of it. We also have some curious examples of places that may not be quite as conventionally religious as you might expect. For example, Aylmer of Malmesbury Abbey, was notoriously, well, I suppose they did quite a lot of research, and it appears that some of the abbots there were murdered by the townsmen and murdered by their own monks. So I don't think it was always quite as pious as we might expect. But I'm sure the majority of the church were true believers. And to get to the top, I would imagine you had to be both politically savvy, you had to be good at people powers, but you also had to be seen to be very religious too. There are examples. There's a 1230 conclave when they're choosing the Pope, where things get very, very animated, and I think it's in 1230 that the people take the roof off the chapel where all the people are staying, trying to choose who's the Pope. And I think it takes 33 days. And I think they reduce them down to bread and water until they make a choice. And they introduced rules after that to sort of make it more sensible. But yes, the infighting and the political intrigue for the role of Pope were likely to be fairly furious. We don't have many records of actually what goes on inside of that kind of thing. But my guess is, like all things, there's a lot of politics, a lot of people very seriously engaged with the discussions, and quite a lot of people wanting their side to win. We also know that there have been papal conclaves that have been held up because of riots on the street. There was one situation in the medieval period, I think again it's 12th century, where the French contingent and the Italian contingent were having running street battles, and everything had to be put off for a while until that calmed down. So street battles in medieval religious institutions were quite possible. In the 6th century, a bishop who became a saint called St. Cado or St. Cado, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, rose to become Bishop of Brittany. He was from very modest stock, There are other stories about him though, so I'm not sure how factual all the stories about his birthright might be, because he is tied up with one of these stories about driving a cat across a bridge and doing a deal with the devil. The devil builds the bridge and will take the soul of the first living thing to cross the bridge. Devil seems to be pretty stupid in these stories because there's an obvious loophole there in the deal. But St. Caddo drives a black cat across the bridge and the devil gets that instead and is very angry. That story appears in lots of different places, especially with very interesting bridges, usually quite spectacular bridges, and I think possibly tied up with the idea that, my goodness, how is that still standing? And very skillful engineers have obviously built the bridge, but then ordinary people are trying to work out how it gets built, with scaffolding, of course, but the scaffolding is taken down afterwards. And people then create these folk tales about the devil building the bridge overnight. So St. Caddo, was he born of peasant stock? I suppose that's plausible, so I don't see why not. During war, it was very possible to earn your freedom. It didn't happen very often, but you could definitely go from servile to free if you were noticed by the right kind of people. Bernard de Guesclin, during the 100 Years' War, rose from minor nobility to become Marshal of the Host of France, which was considered at the time to be quite a dramatic rise. But of course, that's, again, minor nobility, so you're in the top echelons already, to major nobility, which is impressive, but at the same time not going from peasant to king at all. Closer to home in England, William Marshal was the younger son of minor nobility. Again, you'll notice a pattern here of minor nobility becoming major nobility. Because he was the younger son, or one of several younger sons, he was not going to inherit anything under the system they had at the time, and therefore he was expected to make his own way in the world. And he did this very successfully. He was quite a major feature in the tournament circuit. Yes, during the high medieval period, there was a tournament circuit. People travelled from country to country and from place to place, fighting professionally in these organised battles. Tournaments at the time were done typically with rebated weapons. You were not supposed to kill people, although people did die quite frequently in them. They were very violent, but the aim wasn't to actually kill the other side. The aim was to capture the other side, take them to your base effectively, and take quite a lot of their wealth as a result. We have court cases where people argued about paying the debts that they incurred being captured in tournament, and they went on for decades. But most people paid those debts. And William Marshal made a ton of money and became quite a powerful member of the nobility that way. He also, importantly, honed his reputation as a fighting knight and honed his skills as well, tactical skills, because this was teamwork. This was a team of people led by somebody around an area of a few square miles, watched by a lot of people, and there were lots of tactics involved. In fact, William Marshal suggests staying back a little bit, not being the first to go into combat, waiting to see who's left and then capture them. So he had a lot of tactics. He also had a tactic of grabbing the bridle of the enemy's horse, or the opponent's horse, if you like, cutting the reins and then leading that person on horseback to his side where he captured them. During his lifetime, he rose to be Earl Regent, which meant that he was a king in all but name. He was supposed to manage the kingdom for the royalty when they weren't of age yet. And he did that for his whole life, more or less, especially the latter part of his life. I think 3 kings in total he was very senior advisor to, if not Earl Regent. And there is some unusual components around his death as well. He's buried in Temple Church in London. You can still see the tombs there. Which effigy is actually him is up for debate, because it was badly bombed during the Second World War and things got out of place. It's not completely obvious which one's which, but he's definitely there, and one of them is his. But he became a Templar in his old age, possibly at the very end of his life. He was declared to be a Templar and buried in the Temple Church in London, which was a major Templar centre at that period. Now that's unusual because he was married, and Templars were supposed to forego that side of life, secular life. They were not allowed to be married. They were not allowed to have children. and they're not allowed to leave their goods to their family. It was all given to the temple. But in this case, I think at the very end, because he was so well known, he was allowed in to the order for probably a few weeks / a few days, maybe a few hours even, as an honorary symbol of his knighthood. During the high medieval period, there was a dramatic growth in towns and cities. There was what might be called urbanisation. Now, that's going from very small to still quite small by modern standards. It's nowhere near 50% of the population. We're going from 1% of the population to 5, possibly 10% of the population. There's quite a lot of immigration as well. People were coming over from different parts of the world and settling in a more organised way. But the whole business of business was growing. People were doing a lot more trade. There was a lot more international trade. Wool in particular was created here by sheep and exported to Flanders and then woven into high quality cloth and then brought back again. Why we couldn't make high quality cloth in this country, I don't know, but that was the case. There's also an awful lot of coastal trade down around Europe as well, and up into the Baltics. So that was expanding, and the principle of doing business and the principle of shipping, even shares and shareholdings and insurance was starting to be developed, certainly in the late medieval period. This means that if you were bright and if you were capable and you were driven, you could rise in the ranks of the mercantile orders. Now at this stage, places like London were outside the normal ownership structure of the nobility. The nobility owned great tracts of land. They rented out land for people to farm, took goods and services in kind. And the king had the same. The king had great estates as well. London and big cities were separate from that, though. They owed allegiance, of course, but they had their own guild system. They had their own mayor. The mayor of London was an incredibly powerful secular person, possibly second only to the king. And they took it very seriously, this independence of the City of London, the independence of the City of York or the City of Oxford. It was considered to be a very different thing to the ordinary feudal structures, which meant you could rise all the way through. If you were lucky in business and you had a bit of fortune and you invested correctly, you could become incredibly wealthy. In fact, the merchants were amongst the wealthiest people in the land. Actually, they frequently lent money to kings and nobles for the kings and nobles to do their thing, combat battles, invasions, whatever it might be. It was the merchants and the banks, which is where banks evolved from, that were lending the actual money. And of course, the dissolution of the Templars, as we mentioned before with William Marshall, the dissolution of the Templars was to a great extent dependent on the fact that they were lending money to King Philip of France, and he didn't like that and couldn't pay the interest. So he had them disbanded and arrested and tortured to death. Probably largely over some disagreements of doctrine, but I think possibly at its root cause was he owed them a ton of money and couldn't pay it back. There's a chap called John Philpot in 1370. He rose from modest wool merchant to be Lord Mayor of London, and he actually rose his own navy. He generated his own navy to protect wool shipping in the Thames and beyond, because the king apparently wouldn't do anything about it. So he said, right, let's all get together, let's raise our own navy, and let's take out these pirates who are affecting our business. So he went from wool merchant to Lord Mayor of London to Admiral, I suppose. But were there any real historical cases of a real peasant becoming a real king? Yes, I've found a couple. They're not in England. One is Ivalo of Bulgaria in around 1270. He was involved in a peasant uprising, genuine peasant. He was apparently the son of a pig farmer, and he rose to be, actually called himself emperor. He only lasted for a few years though, because the system wouldn't allow him to remain there. But he did rise up. He fought off the Mongols, he fought off other people as well, and was for a while definitely king, but he called himself emperor as well of Bulgaria. So that's interesting. It's even possible to rise to be king if you're a slave. Now, this is a semi-legendary tale, so who knows whether it's actually true, but Ivar the Boneless and Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Lodbrok, apparently installed Eystein, however you pronounce that name, to be king of Sweden. Now, whether it was some kind of weird joke, I don't know. I'm not particularly studied up on that section of history, but it is fascinating that they installed a slave, very specifically a slave, as king of Sweden. In my research, I also found another example from 14th century China. This is the Hongwu Emperor of China, and he rose from peasant stock through the religion at the time, through monasteries. He then became a rebel leader and eventually emperor of China in the 14th century, which is interesting because that involves several of the categories of how to escape from being a peasant. That involves religious orders, that involves war, and then becoming king or emperor for that particular part of the world. John Hawkwood was born in 1320s in Essex and fought very successfully under Edward in the 100 Years' War. He rose to prominence in that area, and then of course what happens is the wars were over, peace was declared, and everybody was told to go home, which isn't much use if all you can do is fight very effectively. So what he did was he formed the White Company. He decided to go to Italy, where there were wars, where you could be paid as a mercenary. He raised the White Company, it became incredibly famous, and he, as a result, became incredibly rich. He was treated as a noble. He was treated as almost a form of minor royalty at the time, and he could charge a lot of money for his armies. But he was never really considered to be noble until he married a woman who was born to nobility. I'm pretty sure nobody ever told him he wasn't actually a lord at the time, and not when he had the White Company backing him up. But he was not necessarily accepted fully into the nobility until he actually married into it, which again shows the emphasis on bloodlines being really, really important and breeding being really, really important. Even if you are an incredibly powerful and talented war leader with an army behind you, if you're not from noble stock or you haven't married into it, you're still not quite noble enough for some people. I wonder whether in the Middle Ages there were forgotten tales, maybe bawdy ones, of peasants becoming kings by accident. It strikes me as a good base tale for anybody to tell, and so I wonder whether that was actually happening at all. Good boy, Ghost, walk on. I like to think that in an ordinary alehouse somewhere, surrounded by working people, there were tales sung of all sorts of mistaken identities and peasants becoming kings. Of course, they're not the sort of tales that would get written down by monks or anybody sort of official, but I think it's very likely. I think it's a human story, and I think, therefore, it would have happened many times, probably.